in the new scenario of the updating of the Cuban economic model. I have a lot of information to share with you, so I really want to talk about, I thought about when we talk about agriculture for so long here, well, what exactly can we tell you about agriculture? So I wanted to share with you some stylistic facts about the Cuban agricultural sector. And let me begin with land. And so this is what agriculture looks like in Cuba statistically. The country has around 11 million hectares of land. If you look at this table, around 56% of those are dedicated to agriculture. So of course, the potential for increasing output is a function of the amount of land dedicated to agriculture. Now, if we look at the amount dedicated to agriculture, the percentage that's actually cultivated, it's only 43%. So only 43%, the other 57% of the agricultural land is not being utilized. So that gives you an insight as to one of the main challenges that Cuban agriculture faces. So one recommendation would be to follow up on your lead, Mauricio, to increase not only the amount of land dedicated to agriculture, but the efficiency of the use of that land. That would be, that's really a necessary reform. I also wanted to share with you the following. If you look at the amount of land, those 2.7 million hectares of cultivated land, well, only 19% are in the hands of the state sector. The other 81%, almost 81%, are held by the non-state sector. These are the cooperatives and the private farmers. So you can see on the table here the breakdown by cooperative. Anyway, you can see it at the bottom here, 40.4% of the agricultural land is actually held by the more autonomous agricultural cooperatives. So 40.4% of the land, it's actually held by the more efficient credit and service cooperatives and by private farmers. If you look at the other table very quickly, notice that 58% of the agricultural cooperatives in Cuba are classified as credit and services cooperatives. These are, again, the most autonomous kinds of cooperatives, okay? An interesting finding here, and the reason why I wanted to share this data with those of you participating in this panel, is that cooperatives actually produce 90% of all the food of all the agricultural products that are produced in Cuba today, not the state sector, but the cooperative sector. Okay, but even though they produce 90% of the agricultural output, that quantity only satisfies 20% of the domestic demand. So Cuba has to import 80% of all the food and all the agricultural products that they consume. Another interesting statistic about agriculture, since this is a theme of the economy that I'm presenting about today, is the following. 30%, that's a very large number, right? If I told you that, for example, I lost 30% of my weight from last year, I didn't, I only lost 10%, but which is quite a bit. You would say, 30% is quite a large number, right? There's a consensus that anything that changes at a rate of 30% is very large. Well, 30%, you don't see it anywhere here, but the 30% I'm referring to the percentage of agricultural output that is lost in the fields in Cuba. 30%. Now, why? Administrative and logistical problems. So there you have another suggestion for reforms, right? Where the government really has to go further and address these administrative bottlenecks and all these logistical problems that are really plaguing Cuban agriculture. Let me move on to the other challenge in agriculture, and you can see it here. And I'll show you a time series that actually highlights that challenge a little bit better than the data that I'm showing you here. But the other challenge is a labor input challenge. So, for example, if you look at my table, you see that there around 820,000 people working in the agricultural sector. They represent only 18% of the total employed in all sectors of the Cuban economy. In terms of GDP, if you take the ratio of the total value of agricultural production to GDP, that is around 4%, okay? Now, look at the breakdown here. The agricultural employees represent 18% of all the total employees in all sectors of the economy. The cooperative workers represent 23% of all agricultural workers in Cuba. So, and if you look at cooperatives, and I'll have to say why I'm emphasizing co-ops so much, they only represent, in terms of employment, 4% of total employment. And I'm emphasizing cooperatives because the Cuban government explicitly has said since the early 1960s that this is the preferred method of production in agriculture, right? It's a superior method to private individual production according to the Cuban government. So wages. So the average monthly wages in Cuban pesos in agriculture is around 1,000 pesos. I know it says 1,006, I'm just gonna round it up to 1,000 pesos. The national average is around 740 pesos. These are not convertible pesos, these are regular Cuban pesos. I know most of you are familiar with the exchange rate duality that we have in Cuba. So if you take the ratio of agricultural wages to national average monthly wages, the agricultural wages are 36% higher than the national average wage, which would indicate, of course, that that would be an incentive to attract more people to come to agriculture. This is a very long slide, so I'm going to summarize it very quickly. The main thing here are the agricultural reforms in Cuba. And if you noticed, I highlighted in red some of the structural reforms, the only structural reform really that matters, which is the transfer of land in usufruct from the state sector to the non-state sector. Okay, so that's the most significant structural reform. That structural reform, after the approval of decree law in 2008 and then one in 2012, is the most profound agricultural reform in Cuba. However, usufruct farming, okay, it's very limited. In the interest of time, I don't think I have the time to get into the reasons why. So the farmers that are working under this mode of production are facing many challenges, and the results have not been what the Cuban government anticipated or what other people anticipated. Then you have other reforms here, mainly administrative reforms and that sort of thing. There's plenty of literature on the reforms. I've written extensively. Carmelo has written even more about the reforms. So I'm going to move on and talk about the distribution of land. You know, one thing that has happened in Cuba after 2007 that's quite notable is the changes in the distribution of land away from the state sector to the non-state sector. So for example, here's data for 2007 and data for 2016 based on what was published back in 2014. And the bottom line is this. We know that production, agricultural production, is a function of the amount of land. Land is one of the three inputs required for producing agricultural output. So back in 2007, the agricultural land, only 46% was in the hands of the non-state sector. By 2016, 69% of the agricultural land was in the hands of the non-state sector. And then 97%, actually I have to revise this number, it says 80%. I know why I made a miscalculation there. So 80% is in the hands of the non-state sector. So you see a shift in the distribution of land. In that regard, that has been a positive development. How else can we talk about the impact of these reforms? Because I do want to contextualize my final points about the new leadership in agriculture based on the performance of the reforms under Raúl Castro, right? This is the Raúl Castro period right here. So we have some areas of agriculture, this is non-sugar production, where you see increases in output. So you can see the categories here. And then you have some key areas of the agricultural sector where you see decreases in output. I just want to highlight tobacco production. This is a principal agricultural export of Cuba, and production is declining. So in that regard, the reforms really haven't produced the results that were warranted, that were predicted, right? So tobacco is the principal source of export earnings for Cuba in terms of agriculture, but you can see production here. I mean, just because of the scale, it's flat, but it's actually declining. Citrus fruit, declining production, and then you have variations in production here. So in terms of physical output, what we really have is a mixed bag with, notice here, if you look at the table very quickly, there are 3 of the 9 categories where you have negative results. And tobacco production is down 8.4%. That is significant for the Cuban economy. So then I flipped over to 2017, and what I wanted to show you here was the breakdown, right, of production by sector. And a couple of things. Notice that in 2017, state sector represented very small percentages of total production, with the exception of 2 things, with the exception of citrus fruits and potatoes. Cuba has a still state-centric regime of producing potatoes. There are reasons for that, but those are the exceptional crops, potatoes and citrus fruit. And if I go back to the other table, notice that production here declined, right? If I go back to the previous table before, notice that citrus fruit, with the state accounts for the majority of production, actually production went down by almost 70%. The production of vegetables went down by 2.2%. So the state sector retains the majority of production only in those 2 crops. Notice another point. Obviously, these are mutually exclusive, so if the share of the state sector decreases, the share of the non-state sector increases. But I also wanted to point out to this final column here. So we have at least 80%, or in the majority of the crops, are being produced by the cooperativas de créditos y servicios and private farmers. Again, to corroborate what I mentioned in the very beginning, that the cooperative sector accounts for the majority of production in Cuba. So when people talk about changing the model now under Díaz-Canel and emphasizing more on cooperative production, that's been going on already. And here you get to see some of the results. Here's the external sector. So, some of you may be familiar with the work of a Cuban economist by the name of Oscar Pino Santos. If you read Cuban agriculture, this is required mandatory reading. He wrote an essay in 1960 called El imperialismo norteamericano en la economía cubana, Yankee imperialism in the Cuban economy, or North American imperialism in the Cuban economy. The main conclusion of that study was the following, and I quote, I paraphrase. Because of low agricultural deals associated with capitalist agriculture and latifundios, low agricultural yields associated with capitalist agriculture and latifundios, Cuba imported 29% of all food and agricultural products. This was a disgrace, according to Oscar Pino Santos. Well, what is the current situation? 50% of agricultural land is idle. We saw that before. 50% of agricultural land, a little bit more, 53%, it's idle. Cuba imports 80%, not 29%, which was a disgrace. So if 29% is a disgrace, what is 80%? 80% of the food and agricultural products consumed by the people. And, as I mentioned before, 30% is lost in the field. Take a look at the table here. You have export and import. Now, exports in red, imports are supposed to generate green, so they're in green. Look at the difference between exports and imports, of agricultural products. Now, somebody may say, well, the exports are 20%, agricultural exports are 20% in 2016 of total merchandise export. But look at the magnitude of the difference. Look at the amount of the value of imports. These are in dollars, of course. $1.7, $1.8 billion, almost $2 billion. of import. So the problem of dependency, the problem of agricultural and food dependency and food insecurity has not been resolved. And so remember, going back to 1960, 29% import of food and agricultural products was a disgrace for the country. Well, now we're at 80%. So I want to be economical in the sense that I really want to, maybe I should have done what Mauricio suggested, begin from the back of the presentation and really share with you what some of the impressions are. So I will conclude by saying that since the 1990s, the agricultural sector in Cuba has been suffering from declining production, declining labor productivity, worker absenteeism. Armando Nova, a well-known Cuban economist, a good colleague, a good friend of the Bildner Center, also a good friend of mine, has said many times that what Cuba really needs is to bring back the farmers to the field, right? But it's not happening. So you notice insufficient administrative coordination, excessive bureaucracy, decapitalization caused by shortages of investment, etc. Of course, bad weather conditions. And on my way here, I noted the losses in agriculture caused by the recent hurricane Alberto. In my province in Bella Clara, this is what I remember. I know this is sort of centric, right? But geographically centric, right? I first looked at the data for my own province in central Cuba, and 60,000 hectares of sugarcane, that's around 60% of all the sugarcane planted, it's flooded. So, and about all the sugar mills in the center of the island, which is exactly where I'm from, those account for 35% of the province's total sugar output. They're totally damaged. All the equipment, not just the mills, the equipment, everything is damaged. So yes, we recognize the impact of hurricanes and droughts and all that. I'm gonna cite, just to wrap it up here, Armando Nova González, and a while back he wrote that there are three fundamental issues that have to be resolved in the Cuban economy. And one, well, here you can see them. The first one is the need to achieve complete realization of property. Now, to a non-student, to somebody who doesn't study Cuban agriculture, and in the context of the reforms, what he means by that is giving the producers the freedom, the autonomy to choose how much to produce, when to produce it, and when to sell it, and whom to hire. Then he talks about the necessity to recognize and accept the existence of the market as a complement to the state in the form of plan. And then he cites the third one, which is kind of, it's a very complex phraseology here, but the absence of a systematic approach to connect the macro and the microeconomic aspects of agricultural production, consumption, and so on. What that means, it's really liberalizing, eliminating the state monopoly on the collection and the distribution of agricultural products. Well, those issues, this dates back to 2013, a paper we wrote together and something that he did on his own before, and we continue to see that, right? We cannot say that those issues have been resolved yet in Cuban agriculture. So those are three of the main challenges that the current leadership faces, having to deal with property issues, having to deal with the functions of the market as a coordinating mechanism in the agricultural sector, and then this idea that 30% of production is lost. And it's not lost because of a blockade or an embargo. It's not lost because airplanes are shooting it down from the sky. It's lost because of bad administration and bureaucratic constraints. That's why it's lost. And problems with logistics, right, that have to do with property rights and so on and so on. So all these issues remain unresolved. And in my view, I think they really have to be addressed urgently by the new leadership in agriculture. I'm only concentrating my observations to one sector of the Cuban economy. You can actually apply that to many other sectors of the Cuban economy. Now, I want to go beyond what Nova wrote back in 2013, and I want to offer some ideas or some views that I think are essential to really restructure the Cuban agricultural sector. But before I do that, let me make a comment that I perhaps should have made in the very beginning, which is that this. Agriculture accounts for around 18% of employment, as you saw before, and I mentioned 4% of GDP. But quite frankly, those numbers underestimate the true value and contributions of agriculture in the Cuban economy. All you have to do is travel to Cuba, as I do very often, and go to beyond Havana, and go to the hinterlands and see how dependent all those towns and all those economies are, and the rest of the island is on the agricultural sector. The direct and indirect linkages and spillover effects of agriculture are very, very large in the Cuban economy. So my point is that unlike many people who study the Cuban economy, I think agriculture matters tremendously. It's one of the pillars of the Cuban economy. It's not just services and tourism and medical exports and all that. Agriculture is critical to the survival of Cuba as an economy. So how do we get there? Well, these are good. I agree with all these three issues that have to be resolved, but I think we have to go further than that. And one major problem in Cuban agriculture has to do with property rights. I think many of you heard me say before here in this forum, in other panels that we had, that I'm Cuban. I was born in Cuba. I'm a Cuban citizen. I'm a US citizen. But I cannot own property, agricultural or otherwise, in my own country. So I face limited property rights. Never mind me as somebody who lives here, but why couldn't I own a farm in my own country? Why can I not own a house legally? Not through my brother, not through my sister. Why am I not allowed to own property? And like me, millions of Cubans who live overseas. That's one idea. Number two, opening agriculture to foreign direct investment. I have to say there's discussions of that, but only discussions. There is a 2014 foreign investment law in Cuba, which in many ways is comparable to the foreign investment laws of other countries in the developing world. In some ways. That's as far as it goes. But it's not open yet. This one, competitive input markets. Professor Mesa-Lago did an excellent study about 2 years ago, and he interviewed many agricultural usufruct farmers, and the most common complaint that they had was that they couldn't find input markets where they could buy essential inputs to produce at market prices, at prices that correspond to their purchasing power, to the real purchasing power, and not to some price set by a government monopoly. The freedom to contract labor and invest capital. Everywhere in the world that you see productive agricultural sectors, they have that. They have the freedom to contract labor and invest capital. The elimination of price controls and other distortions. That's a much more complicated story, but that's also, somebody could argue, well, we have price controls on subsidies and other distortions in the US, in the European Union with a common agricultural policy and so on. They're all distortionary. And I think by the final thing that came to mind was, and I'm using here, just to finish, the phraseology of the Cuban government, to unleash the productive potential, la fuerza productiva, desencadenar, I'll say it in Spanish, which sounds even better, desencadenar la fuerza productiva del sector agropecuario. I'm all for that. I think it's wonderful. But what does it mean? It means to allow the market, or market in plural, labor market, capital market, input market, output market, etc., to function as a principal coordinating mechanism in the economy. That's what it means to desencadenar. My conclusion is not very optimistic, and it's very premature to say this, right? Because the new leadership has been in power only a few months, 2 months or something like that. But from reading what's published in the Cuban media, from talking to people that I know in Cuba, it doesn't seem thus far at this point that the leadership has the political will to take a look at this very critical sector of the Cuban economy and say, we're going to inject all these changes, all these reforms that are going to get it out of the sort of like the pretty dark spot where it is right now. So I offer to you my final conclusion, which is that if, not that I'm saying, pretending that this would happen, but if my advice were to be seek, I would say begin with agriculture, do it fast, do it deeply, reform the sector very quickly, because this is what most people relate to, right? What you put on the table at dinner time and lunchtime. Thank you very much.
We'll have questions and comments later on this at the end. Carmelo.
I always see friendly faces here sometimes that I have not seen for a while. So it's, again, thank you for the invitation, Mauricio. And thank you, Mario, for the organization of this panel. Mario didn't say something which is quite important. And his paper, by the way, is excellent. All the data that he showed you is from Cuban official statistics. Yeah. That's from the yearbook, yeah. The Cuban statistical yearbook. There is not one single figure there that is Mario's. Everything is from the Cuban official statistical yearbook. And so are my data. I think there are like, I don't know, like 20, I'm sorry for you, 20 tables and figures, and only one, half of one, are my own calculation based on direct observation. The rest comes from Cuban statistics, official statistics. Okay, so this is what I am going to do. And an important factor in my presentation is the process of population aging. The other factor, but I don't have time to go into this, is a structural reform. That will take another lecture, so I will concentrate on population aging. But don't forget that the other factor, the reform, have a very important impact on the Cuban economy. And the latest data that I have is from the statistical yearbook of Cuba, 2016. There are a few data that I was able to get for 2017, but it's too early for that. We probably will have to wait until at least June or July to have the first statistics. Okay, so Cuba is the oldest country in the Americas. It was supposed to match Uruguay in 2025. It happened already 3 years ago. So what are the implications of this aging process? First of all, the birth rate is the lowest in the continent. And the fertility rate has been the lowest since 1978. So that's one factor that contributes to the problem of aging. And you actually have also a very high migration or emigration rate. So the combination of very low fertility rate and high number of people who are leaving the country, that results basically in the aging process. And we can divide the population into three sectors. What we call the young tail, which are 0 to 14, and that have been decreasing for a while in Cuba. Second is the middle segment, which is the productive sector, is the most important. Those are people from 15 to 64, and that started to decline. It's very important. This is the sector that supports the young tail, but also the old tail, which are people above 65. And that has been expanding tremendously. So what you have is that the young tail is declining, the old tail is increasing, but the cost of sustaining the old tail is much more expensive than the young one, because particularly health care and pensions. So this is a problem. The dependency ratio in Cuba is worsening and will continue to do so. That's 2016. This is the percentage of the total population which is young. 64% is the productive sector, but declining. And then almost 20% is the old tail. And this is what is going to happen. This will continue to decline. This will decline very significantly, almost 10 points, and this will increase about 10 percentage points. So that's the problem. This is the basic problem. And then the dependency ratio, it means that the productive sector have an increasing burden in the economy. Okay, not just simply the figure that shows those trends. Look at the green curve. That's the old population, and will continue to increase. Now, because you have a decline in the productive segment of the employment, that's what you have here. You have employment declining due to population aging. That's it. This is the economically active population. Here is the highest point is here, but as you can see, in the last 2 years, it's declining very, very rapidly. And this, the red curve is the employee economically active population. Again, the peak is here. You can see it's going even faster down. Okay, the decline in terms of economically active population of the labor force is about 2.5%, but the decline here in the employee labor force, who are the people who are working, is 8.4%, and it's going to continue. So this means that eventually Cuba is going to have a labor shortage. But more important is that people who are working that have to sustain pensions and have to sustain health care, there will be less and less, and there will be more older people that will need those services. And the other issue is visible and hidden unemployment. Well, we talk about visible unemployment, also called open unemployment. But then you have underemployment, which is people that are working, but they are not very productive. Let's say that you open a factory and you need 100 people, workers, but you hire 200. That means that your productivity is going to decline by half, and your salary is going to be also about half. You have a surplus labor there. You don't need 200, you need only 100. So this is the idea of this guy's unemployment. And what we can see here, Raúl begins in 2006, the reforms that Mario mentioned starts in 2007. And in this year, you have the lowest open or visible unemployment rate in the history of Cuba, 1.6. There are very few countries in the world that have had that figure. Usually, the United States now 3.9% unemployment, and Japan is a little bit higher than this. Now, this is a point in which it's increasing, it reaches 2.5. And then Raúl decides that we cannot sustain this surplus labor in the state sector. We don't need this, it costs us a lot of money. So he says we are going to dismiss, by the end of 2011, 1 million workers in the state sector. And further, he says we are going to dismiss 1.8 million workers in the state sector in 2015, 1.8 million. And they start dismissing the people. And you can see how the unemployment rate, open unemployment rate is increasing, which is the blue, right? You see here? So, okay. Now, how many people they dismiss? They dismiss about 500,000. But according to his goal, there were anywhere between 1 million and 1.8 million people which were not needed. That means that you still have, you reduce the surplus labor, but still you have a lot of people there. That's why you can see a decline of your surplus labor or hidden unemployment here, but still you have, when you combine open unemployment with underemployment, you still have 28% of the labor force, which is in one of the two situations. So that's a major problem that Cuba faces. I'm going to talk about wages, salaries, and income inequality. And the first thing that I have done here is to take the nominal wage in the state sector, okay? And it's an average, And I adjusted for inflation because you want to know what is the real wage. I mean, if inflation is very high, the wage may be very low. So that's an adjustment, and that is based on the Cuban data on median wages in the state sector, and also the data on inflation, or the consumer price index.
They gave you the inflation data?
I'm sorry?
They give you inflation data?
Oh yeah, you have figures on the IPC in Cuba. So I am using 1989 because this is the year before the big crisis of the 1990s, okay? What the Cubans call the special period in time of peace. And the economy declined 35% between 89 and 93. And that is reflected here in terms of the real wage. As you can see, there is a decline of 90%. The purchasing power of wages declined by 90%. This is a terrible crisis. This is the worst year, 93. And then it starts a slow recovery, not full. Not full because even here you have an increase faster than before. Still, this is 39% of this wage. So that's about 61% decline in purchasing power of wages in Cuba. So you can see, even after all this year, we're talking about 27 years, still this is still a major problem. Now, in 2016, the average state wage monthly was 740 Cuban national pesos. What is CUP? Remember, you have two currencies in Cuba. You have the national pesos, and then you have the so-called convertible pesos. This is the way the workers are paid in CUP. And that's, when you convert that into dollars, CUC is slightly higher than the dollars, but not big difference. You have about $30 monthly. Okay, there is a big discussion here. I don't want to go into this. People would say, yes, this is true, but you also have subsidized goods in the rationing system, so that they are being sold below the market price. You also have free health care and free education. This is true, but the number of goods in the rationing list have declined very sharply. One of the goals of Raúl is to eliminate the rationing system. And when those goods are taken out of the subsidized price, that means you have to pay 3 or 4 times. So that's not, the rationing list today is not what it was 15 years ago. And the second thing is, you will see there is a significant deterioration in terms of health care and education. Okay. Now, this data here, all this here is from the Statistical Yearbook of Cuba. The only thing that I have done is to allow comparisons. I have converted this into the national peso into the convertible peso using the official exchange rate of Cuba. That's all what I have done. And then what I did is I created a coefficient, meaning that this, which is the median wage in the state sector, is equivalent to 1. Everything is divided by this. So, for instance, your median social assistance benefit, you divide this into this, and you get 0.2. You understand? And this into this is 0.3, and so on and so forth. What is my addition here? I was in Cuba at the beginning of last year, and I went to a lot of paladares, you know, these small private restaurants, and a lot of them. I also went to a state restaurant, and also my family and I, even our grandchildren went with us. We were in a mansion rented for 40% of the price of a hotel, a state hotel. That was a bargain, believe me. And then I asked all the people that have rented houses how much more or less they were making. And this is what I got. So this is 94,000 a year convertible peso. That's about $92,000. Believe me, there are rich people in Cuba. And this is 140,000 convertible peso for the owner of a mansion rented to tourists. Now that mansion, we were 10 people, it was rented for 1 week for about $5,000. Cheaper than the hotel, much cheaper than the hotel. If you divide this here by this, you get 264 times. That's what owner of a paladar is making. 264 times what a wage earner in the state sector is making. Yeah, okay. All right, and this is 394 times. So I don't have figures to measure inequality in Cuba because the Gini coefficient have not been published in 2000, but this is an approximation. You can see that there is a significant and expanding gap in Cuba. There are rich people there. Also notice that the person receiving an assistance, a social assistance benefit, is making 0.2 of this. If you divide this through this, it will be much worse, okay? Cuba had the highest social expenditures in Latin America, one of the highest in the world, compared with the total state budget and a GDP. That's a phenomenal accomplishment. And that lasted until the crisis of the 1990s, when the relationship with the Soviet Union collapsed. I wrote many times that these expenditures were unsustainable in the long run, many times. And as you can see here, this is the blue, this is a percentage of the social expenditures. That means education, healthcare, social security, housing, and social assistance. So that's, in terms of the total expenditures, you get a peak here. It's more than half of the total state budget are the social expenditures. But it goes down, as you can see here, to 47.3. That means a decline of more than 8 percentage points. Why? Because in 2008, Raúl Castro said, we cannot cope with this social expenditure. We don't have the resources to sustain this. We have to reduce them. And then when you are talking about cutting this, and the decline is even higher here, this is in relation to GDP. Your social expenditure compared with GDP, which is the value of all goods and services in the economy. You get a peak here, 36.6, and it goes down to 28.1, which is a reduction of 8.5 percentage points. This means that all these services are going to be affected. If you cut that, pensions, health care, education, social assistance, and I am going to show you what happens. The pension system in Cuba, there are no reserves. It's what we call pay-as-you-go. That means that the state collects a contribution mainly from employers. Most of the employers are state employers. And then out of the budget, they pay the pensions. There is no money put in a reserve, right? Okay, so what happens is your income coming from the contributions, mostly by the employers, is insufficient to pay the pension expenditures. So you get a deficit, right? And what is this? This green line here is deficit in relation to GDP, or value of all goods and services in the economy. And as you can see, there is a peak here, there's a decline. In 2008, Raúl Castro said, we cannot continue to support Social Security expenditures because what the state was putting, financing the deficit, was increasing and increasing. And they did a couple of things. First, they increased the years for retirement in 5. So women went from 55 to 60, and men went from 60 to 65. they didn't do it in 1 year, they did it in 4 years. And the second thing that they did was they increased, excuse me, until I go to the second point. The problem is that 60 and 65 in Cuba is not enough, because many people in Latin America have 65 for both ages. And also, your life expectancy at birth is the second highest in Latin America. Costa Rica first and Cuba second. But the high expectancy at retirement is much higher than the life expectancy at birth. And therefore, what you have is that, yes, there is going to be a decline because this cost was, as you increase the age, you cannot retire, you understand? And therefore, you spend less. And the second measure was to increase the contribution from employers from 10 to 12%. Workers are supposed to pay 5%, but only when wages are very high. A very small percentage of workers pay contribution. So here you have the effect of this 2008 reform. The deficit have declined very significantly, actually 25 percentage points. But this is simply the cost of pension in relation to GDP, and this is the deficit in relation to GDP. The most important thing is this here, because you can see it. But here is my prediction. Cuba have not had an actuarial study. An actuarial study means you measure present and future income in relation to future expenditures, how much money you are going to get in the future and how much money you have to spend on pensions. And my prediction is in 2 or 3 years, this is going to start rising again. I don't have any actuarial study, but by my experience of 40, 50 years working in Latin America, in all Latin American countries on this issue, tell me that these measures, which were positive in the short run to reduce the deficit, won't keep that decline eventually because of the two explanations that I gave you. The employer's contribution in 2013, that was 12%, had to be 21% in that year and continue to increase in 2014, 15, 16, 17. So you can write that down. 2019, 2020 is going to bottom up, and then it's going to increase again. Well, the other way to cut expenditures is you allow pensions to decline. Most countries in Latin America, the law stipulates that your pension have to be adjusted annually either to wages or to inflation or to another currency like the dollar. But Cuba doesn't have that clause. That means that the government, it's at the government discretion to adjust the pension. And this is what happened. And you saw that before with salaries. This is what happened here. The pension adjusted to inflation declined from 100 to 16. So we're talking about 84% decline. And then there is a slow recovery here, but still, this is about 1/2 of what it was. In other words, the pension, the purchasing power of pension was reduced by about 1/2. In 2017, excuse me, the nominal pension, not adjusted to inflation, was 286 Cuban national pesos. Converted to dollars, it was $11 per month. Pensioners have been placed by probably the best expert on social policy of Cuba, Mayra Espina, among the poorest groups in the population. The only way to survive is either that the family helps them or they receive foreign remittances. Those who don't have that income, they have to sell things in the street or even begging. Okay. Now, healthcare. Recall all these are data from Cuba. I am not doing anything here, only making percentages. The number of hospitals in Cuba declined by 32% between 2007 and 2016. Furthermore, rural hospitals were closed in 2011. You just go to the statistical yearbook and you see the figures of the rural hospital, and then suddenly they disappear in 2011 because they were closed. And patients were shifted to regional hospital. The problem is that if you have an emergency and you are not living relatively close to a regional hospital, you may not make it. Before, they were closer. Total healthcare personnel decreased by 22% in the same period. The only figure that didn't decline in terms of healthcare personnel are doctors. Physicians increased by 29%. But, let me tell you, about 40% of the healthcare personnel is abroad. This is a major income that Cuba received. We are talking about, at the peak, $9 billion. And then there are physicians that stay in Cuba, but they decided not to work anymore as physicians because the salaries are very low, and they move to the private sector where they can make more money. Taxi drivers, owner of a restaurant, whatever. So my calculation is that when you subtract that, the ratio of physicians per 10,000 inhabitants in 2016 is the same as it was in 1989, before the crisis. Family doctors is a very famous and excellent program that was established in Cuba in 1986. These are primary doctors, and they take care of most of the illnesses, like the digestive tract, vaccination, respiratory diseases, that type of thing. Well, they shrunk by 40%. The rest are abroad. There is a severe scarcity of medicines, and then therefore access, because this is primary care, access, and also you have closing of hospitals, access and quality of healthcare have diminished. However, infant mortality have kept decreasing in Cuba. This is what you get. This is in the period 2007-14, and this is now a 4.3. I can go into this, but there are two very important articles published in the last 4 years that raise significant concerns about that data. On the other hand, maternal mortality rose from 31 to 42 per 1,000. A lot of abortions in Cuba, problems of hygiene in the hospital, etc. This is the peak. This is 2006. Sorry, that's my fault. This is 2016. 111,400 houses were built in 2006. This was the record under the revolution, and probably in the history of Cuba. And that means that 99 housing units were built per 1,000 inhabitants, okay? As you can see, that goes down steadily. And then finally, in 2016, you have 22,300, 22,100. And then you have, the ratio goes from 9.9 to 1.9. So in terms of the number of houses built, this is a decline of 80%. In terms of the units built per 1,000, is a decline of 8 percentage points. The government of Cuba last year raised what they call the housing deficit from 600,000 to 883,000. My estimate at least is 1 million. Well, the only thing that I can tell you is that for many of the reasons that I have said, and by the way, Mario has a very good article on that, why poverty has increased in Cuba. There is an expansion of poverty in Cuba. And if you have an expansion of poverty, the so-called vulnerable population, you should have an increase in social assistance. But instead of increasing social assistance, this is what you get. This is the social assistance in Cuba. Again, these are official figures. And the blue here, this is the social assistance expenditures in relation to the total budget of Cuba. That's because you get the cut in social expenditures, remember? A very sharp cut. So they go from 2.2 to 0.3. And this one is the number of beneficiaries of social assistance in relation to the population. So if 5.3%, it goes down to 1.6%. So you have a significant decline in social assistance in Cuba. Okay, so let me finish. I cannot go into the conclusion, I'm sorry about that, but the big question here, and that was a question that Mauricio asked us to answer, and Mario tried to answer me. This is very difficult. Díaz-Canel has been in power not even 2 months. So far, he has not said anything important. However, there is a speech that he gave in the National Assembly. I have not had time to do this. Was about, what, 1 week ago, to read this. I think it's dealing with the Constitution. But there are a couple of significant points here. Díaz-Canel, who is the president of the Council of State, replacing Raúl, doesn't have power by himself. His power comes from Raúl. Raúl is the first secretary of the party, and despite the Constitution that says that the chief of the armed forces should be the president of the Council of State, Raúl continues to be the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So the question that I have is, if Raúl was not able to complete the substantial structural reforms in 12 years that he was in power, okay, I think there are very important reforms that are pending, like the unification of the two monetary systems, exchange rate with foreign currency, prices, all the things which are crucial. And the reforms have not had a significant impact. Mario proved that in agriculture. I have shown that the same is true in manufacturing, etc. How Díaz-Canel is going to accomplish this when the power that he's receiving is from Raúl? I simply don't know, but this is a very serious question, how he's going to do that. Now, my conclusion is that social conditions, because of the aging process and the fact that the structural reforms have not had any tangible economic effect, they cannot improve. If you don't improve the economy, you cannot improve social conditions, because the reason that social expenditures were reduced and expenditures in healthcare and education and hospital, all this have been cut down is because they don't have the money. So how they are going to do it? The only way, the same thing that Mario said, Mario Díaz-Canel will have to do what Raúl Castro didn't do, which was to accelerate the reforms, make them more profound, and make them improve the economy. If that doesn't happen, social conditions in Cuba cannot improve. So he has a big challenge. I hope he is able to do something, but we have to wait and see. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions and then comments and brief, and then we take 3 questions at a time. Carmelo, we take 3 questions and then we answer them, sure. Then 3 more. I will ask the first one. Power, the prerogatives of power. Carmelo, you're a specialist in social security systems. You've written books comparing very diverse systems internationally, under very diverse conditions, structurals. Wars in Cuba, some of them, perhaps. Strictly looking at the pension situation, what would you recommend to the Cuban authorities in a very narrow sense? Let's leave out the macroeconomic stuff.
Well, Mauricio, first of all, if you don't improve the economy, you cannot accomplish anything. This is essential. And I have to insist on that, because if I tell you, well, you have to do this and that, but you don't increase economic growth, you won't have the resources to do it. What you have is a situation in which an increasing percentage of the population is old. And that means that they need pensions. And that means that they are suffering terminal illnesses, chronic diseases, which are very expensive. So as older the population is, higher your pension costs and higher your healthcare costs. That is obvious, right? But if you don't improve the economy, how are you going to do that?
That is the question.
No, but I am going to say this. For 20 years, I was recommending the Cuban government to increase the age of retirement and to increase the contribution from the employers, because it's very difficult for the workers to contribute with such a low salaries. And finally, they did it in 2008, but they waited too long, and they didn't go far enough, because this is politically problematic. I mean, if you increase the ages of retirement in Cuba, let's say to 67 for both sexes, people are going
Look, Carmelo, we are talking about how many old elderly folks were in pension system? How many?
Oh, you have like 1.6 million people.
Okay, those people are too old to benefit from new reforms, which will take years to take place.
No,
so meantime, what's to be done?
They don't have, I mean, if you are a worker, an active worker, you could try to recycle yourself and do something else. But if you are under a pension, what are you going to do? I mean, you have to survive. And one problem, you saw the decline in social assistance. One of the reasons for that was that in the Communist Party Congress of 2011, when you have the famous lineamientos, you know, the guidelines for the future, there was a clause that said that any beneficiary of social assistance that have a family member that could help is no longer entitled to this. And the situation in Cuba, how many families can help the pensioners? So that's the reason why it declined even further.
Well, we'll take questions from the audience. Samuel?
First of all, thank you both of you for a very educational presentation.
Samuel, volumen.
I said thank you to both of you for a very, very great educational presentation. Muchas gracias. I have two questions. One is this material both of you presented available in the internet?
I'm sorry, what is that
Is
again?
it available in the internet or?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, could you give the key to how to do
You want us to post your paper, Carmelo?
I'm sorry?
Do you want us to post it on the internet if you want to?
Of course, you can do it. Yes, sure. Yeah.
So okay. My substantive question is, I know that wasn't part of the topic, which is the monetary unification. And what is the problems that are going to happen with monetary unification, particularly who are the winners and who are the losers of which kind of monetary unification. I've been trying to follow this, you know, reading the column of Pedro Monreal and many other people on this, and I need some further refinement from you, I hope, about what are the burning issues about monetary unification.
Okay,
That's two questions. Let's take one more and then we'll...
sure. Yeah.
Yes.
I have just a comment and a question. The comment is, in your economic presentation, the one thing I didn't hear mentioned is the lack of maintenance capital that has to go into the economy each year to maintain productivity. So even if you see the GDP go up, if you don't see the maintenance capital go up, the economy is really declining. So what you're really talking about is a collapse in the Cuban economy.
Well, that's the second question. I saw a hand there. Yes. You have to speak loud.
Why is percentage of total cost so much higher than the deficit percentage of GDP?
Percentage of total cost of what?
Deficit percentage
The deficit of the pension system?
Yes.
Okay,
And
yeah.
that is deficit percentage of GDP. Why is the differences so great?
All right, we'll reply to those questions and then take three more. Carmelo, Mario.
Bueno, ¿tú quieres contestar?
No, so I know that that was outside my theme, but I'll grab the question on monetary unification because it does affect agriculture, production and consumption as well. And the problem is the multiple exchange rates that Cuba has. And the other problem, of course, is to eliminate, and this is what a lot of people don't want to say when they write about it, the need to eliminate the distortions in the system. And when I mean the system, I mean the way that production costs are factored for state-owned enterprises. Okay, so that's a real challenge. The Cuban government says, well, we have an issue with productivity. At the moment, productivity, labor productivity, they're only talking about labor productivity, by the way, they're not talking about total factor productivity. So at the moment labor productivity catches up, we're ready to do monetary unification. But productivity doesn't catch up until you do monetary unification and you get rid of the distortions. So it's like a cat chasing its own tail, basically. I know I didn't give you an answer, but that's really why it keeps circling around and around. A good theme to write academic papers, but you know.
Yeah, well, in terms of the data, Samuel, you just go to Google and you enter Oficina Nacional de Estadística e Información, ONEI, and then you put Anuario Estadístico de Cuba, 2016, and you get the whole anuario there, and then you could go back. Sometimes it's not so easy to go back. You have to wait, you know, a couple of days because something is happening. But you can go back. You cannot go back to 1989. Those I have the whole collection physically. But you can easily compare 2006 with 2016. One more thing on the monetary unification. You have to realize that in Cuba, remember there are two currencies, right? So you have the national peso, and the national peso, that's what the people are paid. Workers are paid in national peso, CUP, and farmers are paid in CUP, and pensioners are paid in CUP. But what they buy is in CUC. Remember, the ratio is 25-1. So that means if you are working and earn $30 a month, I have listed the things that you can buy with $30 in Cuba because the rationing goods are less and less available. And then so you have to have more and more that you have to buy outside at free market prices or go to the black market, whatever. The other thing is that the government, in the state sector, the ratio is not, they don't use CUP 25 times per one convertible peso. It's 1-to-1. So in the state sector, is CUC equals 1 CUC. In the population, is 25 CUP equals to 1 CUC. So the distortions are phenomenal. And you cannot start with the population. You have to start unifying the two currencies in the state sector first. And there will be losers and there will be winners. And this is one of the problems. They are afraid what is going to happen. And the other thing is that inflation is going to increase. There is no way that inflation is not going to increase. And so the population is going to suffer. And only after the unification is done in the state sector, then you can move to the population. And so there will be a period in between in which it will be extremely problematic. I think this is the reason why they have postponed it once again.
I just wanted to quickly say that the own Cuban government auditing agency revealed that of the state-owned enterprises that are undergoing perfeccionamiento, two-thirds don't have reliable accounting records. So when we talk about distortions from the macro, but they're very micro. These are financial distortions. Something else too, there's an exchange rate that they use between state enterprises too that creates more distortions. So I agree.
They don't know what products are good to export. They don't really know because the whole price system is distorted. So they have to do this. Everybody agrees that foreign investors want the government to solve this, but
I'll grab onto the question of capital, net capital investments. I think the question came up about GDP growing and not really showing the capitalization in the economy. Well, in the Cuban economy, the gross capital formation ratio, it's way below the average in the Western Hemisphere. So that's one of the reasons why the GDP of Cuba, it's not growing. If you look at the time series of GDP, you can see what the growth rates are. I want to point out and recommend everyone to read a paper that Carmelo and another very well-known economist, Jorge Perez Lopez, wrote about the understanding the national accounts of Cuba. If you're interested in this, I'll be more than happy to give them the link. There's a paper, they also wrote a book about it, where they talk about the way that the national accounts were changed back in 2005. And you have this very dramatic 11.5% growth rate in real GDP from 1 year. This is the fastest growing economy in the world, more than China, more than India, more than anything else. But when you walk around, you see the degree of decapitalization all over, not just in agriculture, but in the manufacturing sector, in healthcare, everywhere in the Cuban economy. So the conundrum as to why GDP grows and where capital formation is actually not growing, it's one of the mysteries of the Cuban economy. It's one of the few economies that can grow GDP without growing capital formation. It's an anomaly, really.
There was a question, I think it was you there in the back. I want to be sure that this is, sir, is this what you were referring to, this compared with this?
Well, I don't believe in
Okay, so let me explain. This deficit is the deficit of the pension system. Income less expenditures. Income is lower than expenditure. Therefore, you get a deficit. And this deficit is in relation, here you get deficit in relation to total cost, the whole pension cost. What this is saying is that in this year, which was a peak, 43.8% of the total pension cost was not financed by income. You understand? And now, this is something different. This deficit in relation to GDP, and of course it has to be smaller, because here you are using total cost of the pension system, and here you are comparing the deficit with GDP, which is a large magnitude. Is that clear?
Because of lack of, I'm an undergrad student, I have to research more on economics, I think.
Okay, but the paper is going to be available. You should be able to read it, and I think it will become clear to you.
Right, we take 3 more questions. Alfonso.
Thank you very much.
Then-
The question is addressed to Dr. Mesa-Lago.
Louder, please.
I am addressing this question to Dr. Mesa-Lago. Even though it might be probably a good topic for a forthcoming seminar on economic thinking, is there any different thinking? Because I'm trying, of course, to compare the process of in China and Vietnam. By '89, around the same 10 years after 2008, the direction was by that time pretty clear. But then I never heard Raúl saying that it doesn't matter what the color of the cat is.
What is the question, Alfonso?
No,
I got it.
Thinking.
I got it.
Is there any economic thinking that might alter this big picture that you have depicted underneath the universities.
Right, good.
Okay.
People studying abroad.
Okay, are you
That's
going to
one
take more
question.
questions?
You showed on the graph that there is a certain percentage of high-income earning people, that there are wealthy people, or wealth is being generated by a certain segment of the society. Is there an equivalent tax from the government on that sector of the society?
Great question. David?
Yeah, I have a question and a comment. The question for Mario is that you talked about bureaucratization and mismanagement in agriculture as a contributing factor to low productivity. Is there any way to quantify to what extent, in other words, if you could correct mismanagement and bureaucratization to some degree, would it be compensatory in any real significant sense? Would it really make a difference? And the comment that I have that maybe the panelists might want to address, it's more from the psychosocial perspective, that these figures, which are very stark and frightening, have a great deal of implication for how people live in Cuba and how they cope and how they're suffering, especially the aging population, which has become tremendously demoralized over the last 20 years. And I think these figures, however important they are, don't fully show the picture of what it is psychologically like for people who have to, on a daily basis, deal with these hardships.
Right, those are three questions. Right? Let's answer them and then take three more. Carmelo.
Oh, okay. China, Vietnam, and Cuba. At the end of his presentation, Mario said that the major reform that Cuba has to accomplish is in agriculture. And he's 100% right. I agree with him. The thing that the Chinese and the Vietnamese did first was the agrarian reform. And he said it. Actually, he was quoting the most famous agricultural economist in Cuba, Nova. He's saying, let the farmer decide what to produce, to whom sell the crop, and set the price. And also, you added hiring labor.
Yes.
Well, that was make China from a country in which periodically they have famines into a country that is exporting food. They are importing food too, but they are exporting food. And Vietnam now is one of the highest exporters of rice in the world. I think it's the second one. So these people, by doing this simple thing, it's very simple, really. They change completely the agricultural situation, and that eventually, with the other reforms that they did, etc., they have some of the highest. China's the highest growth rate in the world, and Vietnam is quite high too. So if we were going to do that, there will be a significant change. By the way,
Carmelo, what's your main bottleneck in Cuba? What is your main obstacle?
The main obstacle.
the main obstacle to do that, in order to do that, you have to give power to the farmers. And the government won't have agriculture, won't have a secure quota that the farmers have to sell at the price below the market price. And therefore, there will be a problem for a while, but eventually, allow these farmers to produce, and they are going to increase production because they will be making money. One thing, if you are interested in a comparison of the Chinese economy and the strategy and the Cuba, if you give me your email, I will send you an article in English or in Spanish that was recently published about that. A systematic comparison.
Right. The other questions.
Yeah. So thank you for catching the comments about bureaucracy. I try to hide them very well, but you caught them. So at the moment that, that I showed the PowerPoint, it came to mind that if somebody were to ask me about bureaucracy, I would try to illustrate with two things. One of them is and I've been trying to convince Mauricio to let's do a panel on agricultural bureaucracy, but I haven't succeeded yet. But anyway, one of them is the really complicated, time-consuming, and convoluted process to apply for usufruct contract rights in farming. If I were to, I do have the diagram. If I were, that would be my whole presentation, by the way, one-page PowerPoint showing that diagram. It will take me 3 hours to explain it. The other element that came to mind, it's one that's actually, it's being discussed now, Mauricio, with Díaz-Canel, which is it was discussed sotto voce in the Cuban media last year, in May, when they did the ANAP, the Asociación Nacional de Agricultores Pequeño Congress in Cuba. And they said, well, we have to revisit taxation because the grace period is over, and they alluded to Law 113, which was created in 2012, about taxation, the tax system for usufruct farming and for farmers that have land but don't farm the land. That's coming, believe me. The same way income taxes were done and property taxes were done to finance. They're talking about using property taxes to finance a pension and all that. So quantifying the impact of the bureaucracy in a statistical significant way, it's kind of hard to do. But once you dissect the bureaucratic framework in just agriculture, in those two aspects of agriculture, you realize how it really discourages people from participating. I want to make a quick comment about the Vietnam, China, and Cuba comparison, because it hits agriculture right at the center. And without getting too much into the complexity of the processes, there were three things, right, that were essential when China first and then Vietnam in 1986 reformed agriculture. And I think we talked about them quite a bit in all the panels that we have here about agriculture in reference to Cuba, and I'll enumerate them. The first one was land reform, usufruct, but extending the terms of the usufruct so that the farmers feel a sense of permanence to the land. I know farming firsthand. I know I don't look it, but I know farming firsthand. Yes, 100%. So it's our new president in Cuba, right? No, but farming, it's, as you know, you have to be so attached to the land. It isn't something like working here in the service industry and going for a latte after work, right? So there's an attachment to the land. The other reform, and Carmelo has written about this extensively, so correct me if I'm wrong, labor, the contracting of labor, contract law for labor. And then finally, the other ingredient of the successful reforms in China and Vietnam were the emphasis on export promotion. You don't see that in Cuba at all. I haven't read, I know the foreign investment law says, we're going to promote exports and import substitution and so on, but there's nothing concrete in 10 years. Or 12 years of Raúl, no, 2006.
About 12 years.
About 12 years. But the comparisons are there. I have to finish that comment by saying that the Cuban leadership, and I mean Raúl and Machado Ventura and other people have said, no, we're not adopting any model. They're not Chinese, not Vietnamese. We're Cuban, we're not Chinese, we're not Vietnamese, period. This is how they put it aside. Because they understand that the Vietnamese and Chinese model were very, very successful. But it entails radical reform from their perspective. I think I covered. I don't.
Right. So
I have.
Okay. Let's take three more questions.
Mauricio, there is still one question. Okay, these are the figures of self-employment in Cuba. You can see that it's in thousand, right? But you have 201 occupations, and very few are highly profitable. By the way, we conducted a survey in Cuba, and it resulted that in the sample that we took, it was not a scientific survey because it's impossible. We're only 80 people, but the sample that we took, like 90% declare that they have profit. But the highly profitable one are paladares, the small restaurants, and renting of houses or B&B. Those are the real, the rest, they are not making so much money. Now, there are many taxes on the self-employed. There is a tax on income, and the deductions are limited. You cannot deduct all your expenditures, but only some of them. There is a tax on the labor force, which is crazy because it increases your tax according to the number of people that you hire. So the more employees you have, higher the tax is, which is counterproductive because you want a lot of people employed in order to give a job to those in the state sector that have to be dismissed. And then it's on sales and a lot of things. On the general, as a general, taxes are extremely high and burdensome. Now, for these people that are, you know, owners of paladares and I mentioned, they can pay that. It's not a big deal for them. But for the majority of the self-employed, it's a problem. The other thing that I want to tell you is that I have, through the years, made an analysis of the sources of tax income in Cuba. And there are two types of taxes. Direct taxes, that's, for instance, the income tax. And indirect taxes, which is like the sale tax, the value-added tax, and other things. You measure the progressivity of the tax system. As higher the percentage of taxes that are coming from direct, like income tax, and lower the indirect, more progressive the system is. And in the case of Cuba, still, most taxes, I cannot remember the figure, I think it's like 56% in 2016, are indirect taxes. So they introduced taxes very recently, and it's extremely difficult to change the redistributive effect of the taxation. Yeah.
Okay, we will take three last questions, and so this is the last call. Rosendo.
I just want to make two comments.
Miguel Alto.
I happen to travel to China from time to time on business. The difference between Cuba and China is that China changed when Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai died. In Cuba, there has been no change because Raúl is there and does the show behind the scenes. You know, I remember talking to business people in Shanghai. Shanghai used to be hated by Mao because he compared that to the capitalist, you know, the old capitalism. When Zhou Enlai changed, not Zhou Enlai, Wang Xiping, he changed Shanghai. Shanghai today is New York. Okay? And in Cuba, there will be no change as long as Castro is behind the scenes. And another correction I want to make. You mentioned, by the way, congratulations for the presentation. You mentioned that education in Cuba is free. I disagree with that. Indoctrination is free. In 1961, they confiscated and nationalized 360 private schools.
Okay, Rosendo, gracias. Let's take one more.
These presentations, I think, are really terrific. Thank you, Carmelo and Mario. And of course, it's a very depressing picture that you presented. And we see a kind of slow motion demographic train wreck coming and a slow motion capital formation train wreck that's going to combine in negative social terms both of those issues. We've been talking about this as academics, and surely you have presented these ideas, and I assume others have, in Cuba. What is the response when the discussion of these oncoming train wrecks come? What do the policymakers or the economists and related to them say?
All right, that's one. Second question. Third question. Yes.
I wonder whether the low production will also be related to the lack of better technology and outdated machinery. You know, I know that traveling there a while ago, the cars are kind of very old machinery instead in terms of production?
Yes. The young lady, the young woman. We'll take a whole lot of questions because this is the last call.
Really short.
You have to speak loud.
Do you think that Venezuela has been adopting Cuba's economic model? That's it.
I have just a couple of very short questions. First, to what extent, given the price controls and bureaucratic obstacles has happened during the land reform in Chile, has this promoted a black market? To what extent is there a production that is not reflected in the figures because of the black market? Okay. Two, I'm not quite clear whether all the statistics you showed on average wages and so forth, are those all employees? Does that reflect also the self-employed people? Or are those different? Is their income higher? Which wasn't, otherwise, I also want to say this is a wonderful presentation, but those are 2 points I wanted to clarify.
Yes, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of questions, so I don't know if I want to add to the floor.
Well, you have just one question, the main one.
Okay. Yeah, just on the national accounts, I know.
You have to speak loud though, because
on the national accounts, you mentioned that Carmelo and Professor Perez Lopez have written a lot about this. But I think it's important maybe that, you know, they make a mention of this. Because all these GDP figures that are being quoted here, they're all the national numbers. And they're not based on any international comparison. Because in Cuba, you can't do an international comparison because you can't do PVP numbers because the consumption basket isn't published. So maybe, you know, if they can talk a little bit more about progress there. I know that UN Economic Commission for Latin America is doing some work on this now.
that will take 1 hour to discuss. Anybody else? Okay, let's answer those, and I have some questions, but let's address those.
I'll address the ones that I think I could do very briefly in the interest of time and hopefully to have more exchange. So the first one is a policy response in Cuba. I noticed that in the academia, perhaps, and in some parts of the younger generations, they're receptive to these ideas. They understand Cuba has a lot of problems. They live these problems. I'm not so sure at the real implementation level of the policymakers in the government. So academics, we tend to be more open. We should be more open. We should be more receptive to other ideas, even if we don't agree. So I think that's where things are right now. The second question about production in agriculture, why low production? Many reasons. You mentioned the obsolete equipment, that's one reason, of course, but also the amount of land dedicated to cultivation has declined. More than 50% of the agricultural land is just sitting fallow, idle in Cuba. That's a major reason for that. So it's not just about technology or access to technology, but I think it has a lot to do with the fact that there's been a shift there. I'm going to take the question about price controls and the black market because agriculture provides a very great example of that. It's been around since before I was born, since 1960, 1959 even. After the first agrarian reform on May 17 of 59, you have the emergence of the black markets in agriculture. So the price controls, and not only the price controls, but acopio and all the restrictions create the economic incentives for these black markets to be there. And then that's it. I will turn it over to Carmelo, who will address all the other questions. I think I'll leave the more difficult ones for you.
Okay. Very quickly. China and Cuba, Mao versus Zhou Enlai versus Fidel. I agree, 100%. I have written about that. I agree. Concerning the reaction in Cuba with the process of aging, there is an excellent demographer. His name is Aja. AJA, that have published a lot on this. And also the Oficina Nacional de Estadística have at least 2 volumes that I know about the process of aging in Cuba. Where it fails is in terms of policy, because it's extremely difficult to revert these trends. Very, very difficult. they have been talking for a while about creating an incentive, a sort of family allowance for women that have more children, but I think it's a lost battle. It's very difficult to reverse that. Venezuela, yes, but I have to say that Venezuela have been able to reach poverty much faster than Cuba in a shorter period of time. I mean, I don't think there is a model there. It's extremely chaotic. And that you have to attribute it mostly to Maduro. Black market, black market is very important in Cuba. Although the government have developed tools, like for instance, the state shops in state dollars, in convertible pesos, in order to combat the black market. But yes, a lot of people get their inputs in the black market because they cannot find it in the state shops, and therefore they go there. Self-employed. I cannot remember exactly what the question was. Oh,
Wages.
Yeah, you have two complete different wage systems in Cuba. The people who are in the state sector, the salaries are decided by the Cuban government. The people in the self-employed sector, they earn according to the market. I mean, there are taxes, of course, but the price of labor is set by supply and demand. And now, I know you are Gonzalo. He has finished an excellent dissertation in CUNY about the topic that they have mentioned. I think it's a breaking ground.
Background to the environmental side.
Yeah, right. But I mean, the section on Cuba GDP is another important piece that have been published recently is by a former employee of the National Bank of Cuba. His name is Pavel Vidal Alejandro. He has done, the piece has been published by the Inter-American Development Bank, and he makes comparison of Cuban GDP at PPP, or prices with other countries in Latin America. So thank you very much for all the questions.
I have a question, two questions. Bear with me, they're good questions. Carmelo, you mentioned that the economically active population is decreasing in Cuba. Absolute numbers and percent both? Absolute. The economically active population.
It's declining in absolute numbers.
Absolute numbers as well as relative.
Absolute numbers, yes.
Well, that is, and that is, from demography, we know that is usually irreversible, right? So it's long term.
Well, you can change it with immigration, but you have an emigration, the net immigration, so therefore it's very difficult to change
so that what that means is that the structural problem is really huge, because not only do you have a large number of older people, but you also have a
number of productive people.
Yeah. So the dependency ratio is increasing by all counts.
Exactly, yeah.
I had two questions. Let me just ask one last comment. Again, the Cuban authorities have called Alfonso for advice, for feedback, for comments from all over the world on the constitutional reform process. What one or two reforms would you, each one of you?
On the Constitution?
On the
I am not a law, a jurist. I cannot answer that question, really. But I will say that I think Mario will agree with you. have to establish rights to property. That's extremely important, not only for the Cubans, but for investors. That will be an essential reform that they will have to accomplish.
So you would say the right of property.
Right of property rights.
Should anything be left out, like in lineamientos? That long list of lineamientos. Should that be left out? Should that be left out? Should something be left out?
In the Constitution?
Of what is there now?
I say it's a very difficult issue. Maybe you should organize another meeting about the Constitution. I think that would be a good idea. Yeah.
Well, obviously, we'll have to have a discussion on constitutions.
Yes.
From my exercise, if you know someone, let us know, because that's now an important question. Mario, what are the one or two items that should be in the Constitution for you?
Property rights, private property rights.
And that's it?
That takes care of everything. That's it.
How do we attract foreign investment to Cuba? What is the main
Private
impediment?
property rights.
Well, thank you very much.
Direct hiring and promotion of pay.
Tremendo, tremendo.